Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are the luckiest people on earth. We get to hang out with the legendary Joti Brar. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Joti Brar today, and we've got a lot to talk about. Joti, we missed Joti last week, but that's okay. Lots of things have happened, and I'm sure we're going to get a great understanding of the current situation. Now, let's start here. Let us jump right into this thing, and let me show an article that is a pretty interesting consequence. Look at this. Florida considers easing child labor laws after pushing out immigrants. You know, I think we have two issues going on here, because what the liberals tend to talk about the issue of immigration only from the perspective of some moral issue, right? Which is certainly a discussion to be had, right? A moral issue, a legal issue, whether or not refugees have a right to claim refugee status in a given country, and blah, blah, blah. Now, they will never touch the reality that imperialism has deteriorated the material conditions of people in their country. Therefore, that's why they show up. They follow the stuff that we steal from them and drag back here. They follow it back to where it is. The other issue, of course, here is, and let's put this all together, as our economic system deteriorates, somebody has to be blamed rather than the economic system itself. We blame the immigrants. Oh, if we just get them out of here, everything will turn around. The jobs, everybody's situation will better. Well, okay, the scapegoats are pushed aside, out they go. And now the problems, the realities of what was going on from a economic perspective with immigrants starts to surface. Florida considers easing child labor laws. Oh boy, that sounds great for people. After pushing out immigrants, there's a lot to talk about, Joti, but we're all ears. Let's go.
Thanks, Garland. You know, it's really important for us to start getting the message about immigration, mass migration on the scale we see it today. And if we just look at human history, we've always been migrating. But mass migrations on the kind of scale that we see today are purely a product of the operation of capitalism. What happens under capitalism is that the capitalists need the cheapest possible labor force. The law of the market dictates this, right? Because you have to cut costs to win the battle of competition. How do you cut costs? You automate, so you have fewer workers on your wage bill. You have the cheapest possible labor power. If you read Marx's Capital Volume 1, he goes into great detail about how the development of machinery means that skilled labor is constantly being pushed aside for less skilled labor, and the less skilled labor is cheaper. And of course, less skilled labor also means women. In those days, women hadn't worked in factories, then they did, because it was all automated and brilliant. Women are cheaper. And then children. And then there was a massive fight back by the working class to relieve their children from this hideous enslavement to capital, whereby, little children's lives were being used up at an enormous rate to keep the wheels of capitalism turning. We have this image that's been created in our minds about industrial jobs being kind of dignified and well paid, which is a total anomaly. Only in the West, under socialism, it's entirely different. I'm talking about capitalism here, which is what we're all living in. And we shouldn't be in a fantasy about that. We're living under capitalist production relations. Apart from in that small post-war period when the imperialist countries were competing morally with the socialist countries. In those conditions, child labor was like totally abolished and education was instituted instead. In those conditions, factory work was far better paid and protected, and all the workers had trade union rights, and a whole load of things happened which were not normal for capitalism. If you want to know what's normal for capitalism, look at how the factories were operating in 1850 in Britain and 1870, right? Not in 1955. That doesn't give you a true picture of what it's like to be an industrial worker under capitalism. Yes, of course, people look back to a period when they had jobs which were meaningful, i.e. you're producing real wealth and it's useful and well paid simultaneously. That in the West has been a tiny, tiny proportion of our industrial history, and it's gone. We're only going to get back jobs which are meaningful and well paid by making socialism. You're not going to get it back under conditions of decaying imperialist crisis, right? There's no way. There is no way to get back to that post-war situation, which was mainly brought about by the threat of the socialist revolution. And it was a stabilizing exercise in that situation when the Soviet Union was showing the world what industrial work could and should look like in a rational planned economy, right? So I just want to get that out there. The capitalist system needs the cheapest possible labor source. So before World War I and World War II, it was women, children, unskilled laborers, and it was workers living in the worst possible conditions to feed the industrial machinery. And then increasingly, as capital developed into monopoly capital in the Western heartlands, and Britain was the first one, of course, to become, fully fledged imperialist monopoly capitalist power, capital overflows the bounds of its national economy. In fact, right from the early days, you see that capitalism creates a world market and increasingly pulls all of the world into its orbit as either a market for its goods or a labor force to be exploited or a place of raw materials to be exploited, etc., etc. As imperialism, monopoly capitalism develops, what happens is, in order to keep profitability going, the actual manufacturing itself is outsourced to places where the land is cheaper, the labor is cheaper, the raw materials are cheaper, there are no taxes, etc., 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 i.e. you'll get more profit while you're making goods for the world market. So that's the pursuit of the cheapest possible labor power is what pushes highly developed capitalism to become imperialism, to outsource all its production. Export of capital is what happens instead of export of goods. And that's been going on since before the turn of the 1900s, before the beginning of the 20th century for Britain, and all the other imperialist countries, caught up pretty quickly. So this has been an ongoing process for a very long time. It's not something you can just snap your fingers and reverse again. And this quest for the cheapest possible source of labor, number one, it creates the export of capital. So no amount of, you can close your borders to all the immigrants, but if you haven't closed your borders to the flight of capital, the jobs are still leaving, right? So that's number one. Number two, where jobs can't be done offshore, capital needs the cheapest possible labor force. Along comes this wonderful thing called illegal immigration. Now, the whole function of illegal immigration is to create a workforce which essentially can be paid and treated in third world conditions inside the borders of a first world country, an imperialist country, right? You do that by setting up this regime where they're basically criminals and essentially they become like slaves, indentured labor. Their passports are taken very often. They're under gangmasters. They're subject to total, police control. They can be got rid of any time. So they have zero rights. They have no drain on the exchequer in terms of, no benefits, no rights, no education, no healthcare, nothing at all, no rights because they're illegal and therefore criminals. They're the most hyper-exploitable labor force. The imperialists love them. They need them. They use them for all kinds of things. And then they send them away again when they're not needed. It's the very existence of laws against immigration, which in fact are not aimed at stopping immigration. They're aimed at creating this slave labor force and justifying treating them like slaves. They're criminals, they're illegals. And we are trained to think of them as non-human, as somehow a threat to us and our way of life, and therefore we have no sympathy for them. We don't make common cause with them. We don't bring them into our trade unions. We don't demand the abolition of the criminal status that's put on them. These are the most vulnerable workers on the planet. Usually, they're forced into this position of illegal immigration because of something imperialism did to their home country. So imperialism's either bombed them or ravaged them economically to the point where they can't survive and make a decent living. And they're prepared to put up with these horrific conditions. They're prepared to, find money to be trafficked. Again, this is a business that imperialism makes money out of, and ultimately controls. They find the money to get trafficked into the rich heartlands of imperialism. They work under the most horrendous slave-like conditions, precisely because they've been left with no other option. And we, the workers of the West, yes, we are suffering in terms of the existence of this underlayer. Definitely brings down the general pay and conditions of the whole working class. But that's not the fault of the victims. It's number one, it's the working of the system. Number two, it's our bloody fault. Because what are we doing to stop that situation? When we demand more immigration controls, we're demanding more of the same that creates this very situation that we then say, oh, these people are bringing down our pay and conditions. And then we ask the people who that benefits to fix the problem. They're not going to do that. This is something that we have to recognize. Number one, these people are not our enemy. They're workers like us, and we need to make common cause against the exploiters. And number two, we have to recognize that the only real way out of this is the end of capitalism. It's not this, you can't close your borders under capitalist conditions. It simply isn't possible. What we do instead is allow ourselves to become xenophobes of various types, even if we don't buy into, the racial, the skin color kind of ideas. If we at all buy into the idea that, immigrants are our enemy, we start getting into this, this gang mentality whereby we start to allow ourselves to relate to our own exploiters as being on the same side and other workers as being our enemies. And this trick is one the imperialists are really, really experienced at playing on us. And it's one we have to learn to recognize and escape from, because it's absolutely the key to the stability of the ruling class's state. It's the stability, the social peace that they enjoy is essentially because they're able to keep us divided. And this trick of having a bunch of super exploited workers who live in worse conditions and are endlessly vilified in the press so that the rest of the workforce thinks of them as aliens and enemies. This trick goes all the way back to the earliest days of capitalist development in Britain. The British ruling class, their first target was the Irish. They colonized Irish first. It was Ireland first. It was close to home. It was right at the time of the bourgeois revolution. As soon as the bourgeoisie had finished off, Charles I, they were over in Ireland, putting down their plantations and trying to subdue the Irish. And once they had successfully colonized Ireland, the British capitalists used it for exactly the purposes we've said, as a source of cheap labor power. They impoverished Ireland. They used it as a granary to bring food into their cities, which are, they're developing their industry so fast They were draining population from the British countryside and say, well, it's all right because we've got Ireland. We can just get food from Ireland, no problem. So, they were using Ireland as a granary. They were holding back the development of Ireland and keeping it rural and agrarian. They were holding down and super exploiting the Irish people, leaving them totally impoverished. And when those people couldn't make a living at home and were fleeing to Britain to find work in the factory cities and work building the canals and the railways, famously the Irish Navy built all of Britain's industrial infrastructure, right? They were treated as a separate underclass, worse pay, worse conditions, and it was justified by a huge media onslaught against the Irish of how they're not really human beings. Look at the way they live. Look at their religion. Look at their look. They're like this. They're like this. All kinds of characteristics. The thick Mick, the sly Mick, the lazy Mick. All kinds of tropes repeated from the pulpit, which was those days was like the mass media today, right? In the media, but from the church, from the politicians, from all directions in the schoolrooms, it was underlined and emphasized. And the working class, unfortunately, bought into this, allowed themselves to be divided. And this animosity of worker v worker allowed the capitalists to carry on making money and winning all the battles against the working class because the workers were divided against one another. It's a very, very old pattern, and we see it repeated endlessly today. Imperialism really needs these narratives to justify its plunder and spoliation of lands abroad, its wars against people abroad. So if its wars are in the Middle East, we get flooded with anti-Islam propaganda and told that these people are like this, and they're trying to do this to us, and they're trying to undermine our way of life, and they're uncivilized, and they can't run their own affairs. And if you leave them to themselves, they'll all be blowing each other up, and all kinds of nonsense that makes it kind of gives the impression to ordinary workers that there's something uncivilized and different, so different about those people that we don't have to count their deaths like we would count our own. And, there's something natural about, our ruling class and our soldiers going over there and, bossing them about and dictating and dictating, their lives and expropriating their stuff, right? There's something natural and righteous about that. This is the same old trick. This is the way that the immigration narratives are used. But now you look at this situation. So I'm doing my usual circles there. Look at this situation in Florida. What do we see? So Trump's done this whole theater about sending a bunch of immigrants home, and I should imagine that the theater would have induced a lot of immigrants who weren't being targeted to also think, maybe I'm getting out of here. And so suddenly you've got a labour shortage in certain areas that totally rely on this cheap illegal immigrant workforce to make money. Right? And agriculture is absolutely a case in point, right? Agriculture in the West doesn't work without very, very cheap migrant labour. We used to use gypsies. We used to use industrial workers on their holidays we used to use children to do all these jobs. In recent years in Britain, we used to use Eastern European migrant labour, which we could bring over and send back again. But, one way or another, under the conditions of capitalism, producing for the world market, for these type of labour-intensive jobs, your business in market conditions will only survive with cheap labour.
If I may interrupt you, something just wrong. The EU, when they opened up all the borders so you could travel anywhere you wanted, that allowed the poor Eastern European countries that were poorer, that labor to flood over to France, Italy, Spain, etc., for all of that migrant cheap labor. I never thought about that.
100%, Garland. What the expansion of the EU was basically the colonization of Eastern Europe by the Western imperialist countries. And we turned their workers, who were, of course, very well educated and had a great work ethic because they grew up under socialism, and they became our cleaners, painters, decorators, house builders, plumbers, and of course, agricultural laborers come for a season and go home again. So this free movement was not about embracing, it was just simply about saying, oh look, we've got a nice cheap labor force here, and now it's within our borders, and we don't have to, and of course then they didn't even have to have the legal illegal thing. It was literally just the dynamics of their countries having been looted and impoverished put them in a situation where they just had to take whatever work they could. It was the young people, the able-bodied, the ones who don't have ties or who are able to leave their children at home with their parents, come for a few months and go home again, with no rights, essentially. And again, if you looked at the British countryside during that period, what you find is the strawberry pickers or whatever, the fruit pickers, they're coming in from Eastern Europe, living on caravan sites, where they're totally kept separate from the rest of the population. If you didn't know they were there, you would never meet them, and then sent home at the end of the season. So it's literally come in for this many weeks and go away again. You'll earn this much, money, which sounds like a lot, except for you don't realize how much it costs you just to feed yourself when you're doing the job. And you'll find that with a lot of migrant laborers, they get conned into the idea that, coming to Britain to work for a season in the hospitality industry or a season fruit picking, because the money sounds humongous to them from where they came from. But of course, they've got to live on the money while they're here before they get sent home again. And what they find is it's an endless circle, because they go back not much better off than they came, and then they have to do it again and do it again, right? But anyway, coming back to the thing in Florida, what we have to understand, Garland, is in the decaying capitalism in crisis, the economy, pushing out the immigrants isn't going to create well-paid, suddenly all the jobs are going to be good and well-paid. It's nonsense. The jobs that the immigrants are being pushed out of will still need to be done. But for those businesses to remain viable, they'll need to be done at the same rate. So here we see Florida saying, oh, I'm sure there are lots of people in the USA who would do that job if it paid properly and could support a family on it. But it doesn't, and you can't. And the reason for that is capitalist economics. The reason for that isn't the immigrants. The reason for that is capitalist economics. If you're not challenging the system and you're blaming the immigrants, look what you get. Okay, now we've pushed some immigrants out. What we have is a bunch of hyper-exploited, really low-paid jobs. Who's going to do them? Oh, I know. Well, our kids are failing in school anyway. So, and the families are all really poor. Let's get back to the good old days when it took 5-6 members of a family working full-time, half of them kids, just to keep a roof over their heads and maybe shoes on the feet and not very much else. Right? Those were the good old days for capitalism. Yeah. And those are the days we're going back to. If you want a picture of what type of an economy we're heading into, look at the USA or Britain or France in the 1930s.
Yeah. Yeah. And so now what we have is this, it's something we talked about a while back, and that was sweatshops. Right. And that's when I started to realize that basically we had that here. Yeah. You mentioned the 1930s. It was the dire working conditions for the for people. Then what do you know? The labor unions came in. What happened? The working class came together to stand up against the people who the ruling elite, and they forced them, and they said, we won't do the work unless you pay us properly and give us benefits. Okay. The working class comes together in unions. And now we don't have the sweatshops, and people have to make an honest living, pay an honest wage, et cetera, right? So what are the sweatshops? They then say, well, we can't do it here. We'll go to Bangladesh. We'll go to Vietnam. We'll go to wherever, Guatemala, wherever, Haiti especially. And we'll go there where there are no unions. And if they try to get unions, we'll overthrow the government and put some puppet dictator in to make sure there are no unions. And they literally did that in countries where the people tried to change the laws. They overthrew the government and put a puppet dictator in to kill people and make sure they can have that. Okay, here's my point. Now they still have the sweatshops here with the illegal immigrants. They created where, well, we can't have sweatshops here. Oh, yes, we can. All we need to do is create an illegal class who's a class of desperation, and then we can use the class of desperation that'll keep their mouths shut for fear of being thrown out of the country. Okay. Things still aren't working where now, so that desperate class has to be scapegoats. Oh, we got to get rid of this. They're the ones that are really screwing things up. The poorest people in this country, many who can't even speak the language, now they're the ones who are destroying the country, not the rich people who make the economic decisions. Nope, not the system, nothing. It's the poor guy picking friggin' avocados in the Valley of California. He's the problem. Okay, you get rid of him because it was a scapegoat operation to blame him. But now that you've gotten rid of him, reality hits home. Uh-oh, we got rid of him and we don't have an excuse anymore. But we still need sweatshops. We still need dire working conditions. Okay, we'll change the child labor laws and we'll go back to dire working conditions for here. It'll be acceptable for children for a while. And then as the circumstances deteriorate even more, we'll start to do away with more of these restrictions. You know what I mean? Like, to me, that's the camel's nose under the tent. They're starting to get rid of the economic restrictions that were brought upon by unions. Get rid of the unions first, and then bit by bit, you get rid of those. And before you know it, we're back to sweatshops and people are getting their heads yanked off in looms.
Totally, Garland. And, you know, I saw a phrase in there, one of the people presenting this measure talked about, would you believe, parental choice. Oh, you know, parents should be able to choose whether their children are hyper exploited or not. There should be no protections. Parents should be able to, and it's like the homeschooling movement, isn't it? It's like, you know, people stop trusting the education system and start putting their kids out of school. And then it becomes like, oh, well, you know, actually, it's really good if people just homeschool, as in just don't have an education. Right. And then it becomes this, you know, whole, you know, they become again, you know, well, that's parental choice. It's up to the parents. Now, this is, you know, bourgeois liberalism, like liberal in the philosophical sense of like total individualism gone absolutely mad. A child is the product not of his parents, but of society. And, you know, any parent who's brought up a child past the age of 10 knows full well that their influence on what that child is learning and understanding is actually quite minimal. You can guide, you can be an example, but the truth is your child is being brought up, whether you like it or not, by society. You know, the idea that they're just, you know, they're the parents' kind of private property, and that they only, you know, how they grow up is totally dependent on you, and you're the only one who's responsible for, like you just own them. But a child is a person, it's a social being, and society dictates what the child's life chances are going to be, not the parents. Society.
If I may, let me give you an example. That's why when I was growing up, every morning in class, you had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Put your hand over your heart, look at the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag and all that, right? That was the government saying, we are going to put certain things into your child's mind. We're going to direct your child in certain ways to think, etc. And let me add this. Homeschooling is great. That means we don't have to pay teachers. We don't have to build buildings for the schools to get children to be in. We don't have to pay the janitors and the people for the schools and keep it warm. We don't have to have school buses and pay school bus drivers and buy school. We don't have to do anything. We can leave them there. We can shove some paperwork in there. You can send it back in. You can say you do it. Yeah, if you do it, great. If you don't, and in the end, if you did a good job, fine. Your kids are, and if you didn't, who cares? Because we don't. And right now, they're getting rid of the Department of Education, and everybody and a bunch of people are like, yay! All they're going to do. They're going to get rid of the Department of Education, and they're going to shove everything downward to the states. The states are going to go broke. They're not going to have money to build schools or this or that, and the education is going to deteriorate. And we've got to compete with China as China builds schools. As in the Chinese schools, they have literally like big screens with satellite communications, and they're putting out all of these they're doing all of these things. Their kids leave school, they're high tech can be, and our kid is sitting home, mom who's generally not all that well educated. Generally, what do you think? Most of the time, oftentimes, the what has happened in recent decades is, in my family, the children are more educated than the parents. So you're going to have a parent oftentimes that's maybe not well educated trying to educate a kid, and they can't do math. They have no clue what it is, much less coding. They can barely get on their computer. They need the child to help them get online on the computer, and they're supposed to do that. So what you have is, as they say, we're going to stand up and we're going to compete with China. China's putting out STEM students, and you're putting out kids that you can't even recognize their own name, if it's a picture of them and they're looking in a mirror.
The rise in demand for homeschooling, and I absolutely understand it because I've seen it with my own children, how it's a result of the fact that the state system in the imperialist countries, as it becomes unpicked and unrolled, and as the pressures mount on working class families, and as mental health problems mount amongst the working class, the pressure in the school system that's been cut to pieces, in a society that's under pressure, it doesn't deliver for a huge proportion of the kids who are in it. It's a sink. It's not really an educational venue anymore. So a whole lot of people, with good reason, give up on it. If their kid slightly can't quite cope with the kind of draconian ways, schools are run like prison camps a lot of the time now.
Oh, how about this? They bring in what is it? They bring in I'll just put it like this. They literally, in some of the schools in the United States, bring in men scantily clad like women, and they call it drag queen story time to read to the kids. And I'm like, actually, I wanted my child to learn how to read and write, and there's some guy prancing around in women. I know I'm going to be said, accused of misgendering somebody or whatever, but I don't care less. That is an education, unfortunately. But maybe that's an education that I'm not interested in my kid having. And what happens when they do that, it then encourages a certain group of people to say, I think I'm going to do homeschooling because I don't like this cultural stuff right here. So in a way, devious and diabolical kind of way, it works to push people out of the school system, save them money, and send the kids home. And hey, we can close another school. Everybody's mad because we had drag queen story time.
Definitely. The whole, that's the way that culture wars are played in schools. That's one aspect of the fact that our society is really decadent and dying. But it's more than that, Garland. The reality is the schools are under such pressure because they're utterly underfunded. And on top of that, the social problems of the pupils are multiplying. Now, we live in a situation, so today in Britain, the schools have lost so many of their facilities. Many of them have lost their playing fields. They've lost their music departments. They've lost their art department, their drama department, all the things that give you a rounded, developed education. The teachers are less and less well paid and respected, so they're under pressure. It's all being privatized, the system. So the schools are now set up in order to get measurements rather than to give an education. And those are different ways of measuring your success, right? Are we making sure we have the right statistics on attendance and on uniform observation, or are we focusing our attention and efforts on the children? Classroom support cut, and classroom support and all these facilities that help develop a real sense of community and develop a real education and a multifaceted, rounded person. All these things being cut back for working class kids in a period where unemployment's rising, social problems are rising, housing problems are rising. Many of the children in the classrooms that they're already under pressure, the teachers are under pressure, they're under pressure from funding and measuring and all the rest of it, paperwork that they have to do on top of their lessons. On top of all of that, the kids in the classroom, half of them are hungry.
Homeless in America. A lot of them are homeless children. I know. I know a lot about school buses. When I grew up, my mother had a school bus company, and so I still know people who have school bus companies in the region. And here's something that school bus companies have to deal with now. They have to pick up homeless children, and they'll tell them, normally you go in a community and you pick up children the whole block. You pick them up this corner, that corner, this corner, that corner. Well, now they're like, well, you have to pick up a homeless child here. And some of them will literally have to drive several miles out of the way to pick up one homeless child who's staying at a hotel or motel or nowhere. And they go there maybe for a couple weeks and the child's there, and then they never see the child again because they're homeless and they're staying wherever they can. That's a big thing now, homeless. And how's a child supposed to get an education when they're sleeping outside in a tent or whatever? They don't have any computer, or they don't have lights at home, and they're bringing tent.
Right. So this is the education system that we are now looking at. And that's beside the fact that when the state education, as you said earlier, when the state education is granted by the capitalist class to the working class, it's always a kind of a poison chalice. It's always a kind of a double-edged sword, right? I'm not saying that, it's bad for workers to win the right to education for their children. It's good. For a start, it's a head start to mastering Marxism that you can read, right?
Yeah.
So let's just put it there. But the reality is, along with all of the facts and useful information you get a whole load of rubbish. You got a whole load of propaganda and ideological brainwashing. History lessons are a joke. I'm sure you'll agree with me on that.
Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. That kind of crap.
Right, exactly. So they glorify imperialism. They lie about its crimes. They lie about almost everything to do with class. They don't teach anything to do with class, of course. So, there's a lot of drawbacks to a capitalist education, but still it's better than no education, right? It's a start. And, what we see today is a real degeneration and a cutting away at the foundations of the capitalist education system. And this actually comes back, Garland, to the question of, revitalizing the economy that's in everybody's minds in the West now, as we see our economies really going down the toilet. So how do we reindustrialize? How do we revitalize? And of course, the thing is, a genuinely productive and useful economy in the modern world, with, as you said, China's producing all these STEM graduates who are capable of designing robots and, coding new AI programs and all the rest of it. And we are not. And, to fix that, to genuinely create a vibrant economy, you need to do several things. And of course, one of them is you need to revitalize the education system. And just setting targets and saying, we need more STEM graduates, like, you don't get that without investing. A STEM graduate doesn't just learn maths. They have to have a brain that works. They have to have a proper education. This thing of, because at the same time as they were making cuts, I can only talk about the British education system, but I'm sure we're following in the footsteps of the Americans here. As they were making cuts to the education system, they were bringing in a kind of privatization by the backdoor mechanism. I won't bore you with all the details, but in order to turn schools into business units, you need measurable outcomes. And part of this whole getting measurable outcomes things means you set some things that you're going to measure and score schools on and teachers on. And what that means is the schools focus all their resources on those particular things. And they cut everything else because they haven't got the money for it and they can't give it their attention. So they're massively focused on attendance, and they send a whole load of stress through everybody about their attendance percentages, which actually I'm sure undermines rather than boosts attendance, to be honest with you. I think good attendance comes from people being happy, not from being shouted at about attendance. But anyway, that's by the by. But they do this focus on literacy and numeracy, which, by the way, they now talk about to 4-year-olds. Instead of talking about, sums and maths and English and spelling, they talk to kids who are age 4 in the classroom, literacy and numeracy and learning objectives, and all this kind of teacher training vocabulary has been introduced to the classroom in a very anti-child, anti-human way. It's very anti-learning, actually. It very undermines the experience of enjoying and being interested and engaged in your education. But anyway, so by doing this, saying, oh, well, we need people to be better at maths, so we'll focus on maths, but we'll cut out all the things that develop a good mathematical brain. And in fact, there's even experiments have been done, by head teachers who have had a bit of leeway. Now and again, there'll be a head teacher in a pocket somewhere who gets a bit of leeway, has a bit of a brain, and is able to galvanize some resources and does something like this. There was a school in, I think, Bradford. It was a town in the North Yorkshire area of England, formerly big industrial town, a large Pakistani, Bangladeshi type population, because there were a lot of factories there. There were a lot of immigrant workers there in the time when Britain was bringing in Asians to run the factories and work in the factories. Then the factories closed down, so there are these large immigrant populations there. And this head teacher was teaching in a primary school where most of the kids didn't speak English as their first language. And he was trying to work out how to raise outcomes. And do you know what he invested in? Music. He got every single child in the school from 4 upwards playing a musical instrument, singing in a choir, and doing music every single day. And what happened? They developed their language skills, their English skills, their maths developed, their whole cognition developed, their sense of community developed, their happiness and engagement with their education developed, right? But of course, music is seen as a frill by most schools. Cut it off because it's irrelevant. So you see the upside down nature of how this focus on maths and English doesn't get you better results in maths and English, right? And I'm not sure it's even really meant to. I have a strong feeling that the ruling class is not as stupid as it pretends to be. It baffles us with all this crap. But I think there's a bigger, deeper problem for the ruling class, which is this. It granted us an education, and for a while it worked to have a large percentage of the population fairly decently educated. As long as there's jobs for them, that's fine. But you know what the ruling class really doesn't want? A bunch of critical thinking, well-rounded, educated people sat on the dole who know fine well that it's not their fault they don't have a job. Now, our school system basically is shaped in such a way as to give you the message from really, really young that the reason you're not getting on in school is because you have failed. And you get that message. Some kids are getting the message age 4 when they first step in the classroom and they don't behave the right way or whatever. There's a 4-year-old boy and he can't sit still to do some learning objective. And he already getting the message, and the teachers have already worked out, we don't have to worry too much about this one, right? And the point is, you get through your school life, you get trained to believe that it's because you haven't worked hard enough and you haven't tried hard enough, that it's not the system failed you, it's that you failed. And therefore, when you go out and have either no job or real dead-end, low-paying, uninteresting jobs, that was because you are not very good. It's nothing to do with the system. If you genuinely make an effort to educate everybody under this system of capitalism, where all the people are not going to be used productively or usefully, a whole load of them are destined to waste their lives on the scrap heap. And capitalism can't solve that problem, doesn't even want to solve that problem. It needs the army of the unemployed. That's something else we really have to recognize, Garland. Capitalism actually has to have this surplus army of labor, the reserve army of labor, Marx called it. It needs the unemployed so that at times of kind of boom demand, it can just pull them in quickly and throw them back again. And at all times, they, never mind immigrants, the army of the unemployed are exercising a downward pull on the pay and conditions of all of those employed, because the fear of unemployment keeps people on the straight and narrow as far as the capitalists, the employers are concerned. You'll put up with a lot if losing your job means you end up on the scrap heap.
There's actually a term in the US, and I don't know if you've heard it, structural unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
That's the term that the so-called economists use here. Yes, we have structural unemployment. And what they argue about is
The right
what
amount.
percentage. That's what they'll argue about. That's how you know whether they're really for the working class or not. One group will say the structural unemployment should be 1.2%. No, it should be 4.5%. Why? I stand for the people. I say 1.1%, but they all agree there should be structural unemployment. And I worked with John Conyers' office, and he used to have always put this bill. He was a real lefty, right? And he used to put this bill in every year, the Howie Hawkins full employment bill. And the bill that he argued was, I mean, he didn't come out and scream he was a Marxist, but he didn't really have to. But I don't know if you know it's about John Conyers. He was actually one of Martin Luther King's lawyers, right? He died recently. But this bill said that he would put in basically said the government, if people that are unemployed, and we have 2% unemployment, by law, the government has to provide jobs for that. So we wipe out the unemployment. No matter what, there can't be unemployment. Anybody who wants a job must have a job. And if there's no, kind of like what they did in the during the Depression here, where they came up with the CPC and they came up with these various work programs to stop revolution. Obviously, when unemployment gets to 25%, you're going to have a revolution. They didn't do that to help the people. They did that to stop a revolution. But bottom line, and now you and I understood that bill was never going to get through. But that was Mr. Conyers understood. He used to say the importance is to have this discussion and to force this discussion and to push back against the structural unemployment people and to make the argument that everybody can be unemployed, should be employed, and can be unemployed. But anyway, so I just wanted to throw that at you. This was 2009-10 when I was working with his office. But it makes the point. Structural unemployment is part of the system. I guess that's what I was getting at.
100%, Garland. And here's the thing. This should be the working class's demand, full employment. But we make the demand in order to really help to highlight to our fellow workers, number one, this is an absolutely just and legitimate demand. There's loads of work that needs doing, and there's people who need work. So what the hell? Why can't we put those things together? What we need people to start to understand is it's capitalism that gets in the way of us looking at all the things that need to be done and getting all the people who need work and putting those two things together and everybody having useful, socially useful, meaningful work that contributes to all of our lives getting better. Every day I walk up and down the road outside my house, around my house, and I live surrounded by fields, but very, very close to the edge of the city. And there's quite a lot of industrial activity around my road and just a lot of people coming up and down, whatever. Covered in fly tipping and litter, absolutely everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. And the whole of the country is getting like that because this is another service that's been cut to the bone. Right now in Birmingham, all the streets are full of rubbish because the Birmingham City Council went bust. And they've gone, oh, well, in order for us to balance the books, you bin men need to all take a $6,000 pay cut. And the bin men were like, I'm sorry, what? So they've gone, they were having rolling strikes. Now they've gone on an indefinite strike. And literally there's rubbish and rats all over the streets of Birmingham, right? Because
disease follows. Disease follows that dirt, filth.
And the ruling class, will, as long as this system remains, they benefit by sweating the people. And when they have a crisis, they do everything possible to make us pay the price so that they can survive, right? We have to get these messages, Garland, and stop allowing ourselves to be divided against one another. We have to demand full employment and help people to realize that it's capitalism that stops full employment. It's not immigration. When there was no immigrants, there was unemployment. And the ruling class will not do without unemployment. Absolutely won't. There's no section of the ruling class that stands for full employment. There isn't, right? There's not even, and if you look, there's not even a section of social democracy that stands for that, because the social democrats, whether that's a Bernie Sanders type or a Jeremy Corbyn type, they stand for making life a bit nicer for the workers under capitalism. So what they stand for is, oh, well, the people who can't be employed should get nice benefits. And okay, we believe that under conditions of capitalism, the unemployed are not to blame for not having work. So yes, they should get benefits. But benefits is not our demand. It's not our program that people spend their lives living on these, shitty handouts instead of using their talents and their energies to benefit themselves and society. It's a broken society that is unable to give useful, meaningful work to its people.
Wow, I'm really learning a lot from this. And one of the things that I'm seeing is that, before we go, one last thing, the external expression of this. Here's what I mean. Okay, we've talked about schooling and immigration and those kind of things. I did want to throw this at you before we go. One last thing. So now Donald Trump is saying we're going to do tariffs. And here's what he says. It's China's fault. This is what we get. China, these other countries are doing us dirty. These other countries are taking advantage of us. These other countries, they're the ones that are making things bad. And now we're going to put tariffs. Any car that's not made in the United States, it's going to be a 25% tariff on it. And now that's going to hurt other countries and drive them into poverty, particularly Europe. Europe's it's really going to hurt, like European cars are screwed coming to the US. But again, to me, it's simply saying we're going to eat Europe for lunch. You know what I mean? Europe's going to suffer. So what? We're going to drag down. Might I add? And the answer of the Europeans is this: war. We got no industries whatsoever. What can we do? How about military Keynesianism? I got an idea. We'll put $1 billion into war $1 trillion because we got to stand up against the Russians. And I'm thinking, well, number one, the Russians don't want to fight you. Number two, couldn't you come up with another way to industrialize other than just war? And last but not least, this is a kleptocratic society. So if $1 trillion is available for anything else, you bastards are just going to steal it through corruption anyway. Whatever your plan is, you're just going to steal it all. And it's another, but of course, that's the plan. Anyway, your thoughts on that? Let's go with the European money to $1 trillion to stand up with to Russia, which, by the way, isn't materializing anyway. But what little does materialize, they'll steal every stinking dime of it.
And they'll steal every stinking dime, Garland, because their whole position is a contradictory one. And they can't resolve these contradictions. They're stuck in this situation of very degenerated, very late stage, very advanced decaying capitalism, capitalist imperialism. They have exported all their industry, and it's too late to cry about it. The fascinating kind of thing that some comrades of mine noticed, I think Alex McKay and Kit Clarenberg, they do this series of programs called Decline and Fall, which are definitely worth watching for people to go and find those. But they were talking about how when Starmer made his announcements about we're going to put this much money into reindustrializing and we're going to build up our arms industries again, all the stocks of the British arms companies went up. And then, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks later, they all plummeted down again because they were after people kind of sat around a bit, scratched their heads and went, okay, the thing is, it's not that easy to do that. And we can't just do it like this. Then it's like, oh, how are we going to do it then? Oh, I know. We'll send money to companies in Asia and they'll build our weapons for us. Literally. So, because it's all very well to do a lot of theater about reindustrializing, but as we talked about, reindustrializing, you can't just build up your arms industry without building up all the other industries that support it. Britain's original armaments industry was built on top of this huge industrial base of, steel building and coal, energy production, and, everything, right? Metalwork and all the things that you need, all the component parts, engineering of all types, and then you have that on top, and you of course have a workforce that's able to run all these machines. Now, of course, in modern factory workers, they need a certain level of skill because you're now working with robotics. If you're producing, as all these companies ultimately do for the world market, you've got to do it in a high-tech way. You're working with robotics. You need all of these layers in the economy that starts from a workforce that's educated the right way to all of the component parts of industry that underlie then your armaments industry, and they all have to, you know, play into one another. That's not a short-term project. That's not a, oh, I'll have that sorted for you by next week project. That, you know, so much of the supply chains feeding even present day industrial production that's left, or armaments production that's left in Britain, has been being whittled away and allowed to die over the last 20 years, 30, 40, but particularly the last 20. You know, they've been last remaining pockets of specialized manufacture of various, you know, types of components and commodities, and they've all been left hanging until they've just withered on the vine and closed shop, and the people who were doing them have gone off to do other things. And you don't just reassemble that type of knowledge by clicking your fingers and saying, we need it back, right? That is a whole, you know, it's a generational project, and it would require a total refocus of the economy, and it wouldn't, in the short term, it wouldn't be profitable. And the problem is the whole system is facing this crisis of profitability. So how do you do all of this profitably? And as you said, Garland, you know, the model now has become in these industries to take 10 times the genuine cost of producing something off the government, and then produce something very slow, very late, very bad quality, but it's all right because who cares? It doesn't matter. Well, this maybe worked in the unipolar moment of kind of 1995 world, but increasingly the fact that all of the Western powers have allowed themselves to rely on the USA, and that all of their industry they've exported and allowed to wither and die, and told themselves that they were, you know, doing very clever financial things, and that you know, that this is where you make the money anyway, through the city and through the stock exchange and through export of capital. You know, they've created for themselves a situation from which there is not an easy escape. When we look at Trump, or the Trump regime's tariff war, it's delusional. And it's totally self-annihilating, as far as I can see. He, in an attempt to respond to the crisis, they are in fact, I think, accelerating the crisis. And when you look at, you know, what does it actually mean to put 25% tariffs on cars coming into the USA from abroad? Okay, what it means is that first thing it means is US customers, US people who rely on cars because the public transport in the US is almost non-existent, US people who have to buy cars will have to pay more for the cars they buy, right? I think there's going to be a massive boom in the second-hand car market. People are not going to be queuing up to buy new cars because they'll get much more expensive. To a certain extent, what you say is, okay, American car manufacturers now have a larger share of the domestic car market. But that domestic car market, you just shrank it by making it all more expensive at a time when everybody's in trouble anyway. They're all going to start queuing up, as I said, for second-hand cars. And they'll try to counteract that, I bet you, with green measures. This is a good one this is one of the ways they've used to try to boost buying of new cars. They'll do tax incentives for buying a new car, and they'll do green measures where it's like, oh, you can't drive an old car in the city. You'll have to pay a charge because it makes nasty emissions, so only new cars are exempt from the charge, right? So they'll do things like that to try and incentivize buying of new cars. That's one of the ways since 2008 they've been trying to keep the car market going. But fundamentally, you've just made life more expensive for American workers by doing that. Did you create a whole bunch of new jobs? Well, I'm not really convinced that you did, right? They say, oh, we're protecting our homegrown industry. But are you really? Is that what's actually happening? You know, in the days when the imperialist countries that were new capitalist countries, they all engaged in protectionism. America did it, Germany did it, because Britain could outcompete them all. So they protected their developing industry, but it was developing from the beginning, and it was being heavily invested in to grow. That's not the situation we're in now. If the American car industry wants to compete on the world stage, it will have to reinvest in high-tech plants, mostly companies that are American that have been investing in those new plants, they've been building them elsewhere for the reasons we said before, because the labor and the land and the parts and everything is cheaper. I'm pretty sure Tesla has a big factory in China, right?
Mexico too.
Right.
A lot of American companies, American cars, people talk about buy American cars. A lot of them are made right across the border in Mexico because the labor is cheaper. So actually, this is going to have a devastating effect on a lot of American car companies, because all of these cars and trucks that they built in Mexico, they're not going to be able to sell here.
Because it's not a Mexican car, right? Is it? This is this is what I said earlier. If you can't close the border to migrants and think you've solved the problem when capital is free to go wherever it will make the most profit. You can't solve these contradictions of capitalism fundamentally. And the arguments in the ruling class about how to solve the contradiction and how to survive the crisis, on both sides, they're totally flawed. You can't get out of this. It's a Gordian knot. All you can do is cut it. Right? There's no way to untangle this and make everything nice. This world they want to get back to was never what they pretend it was, and it can't be reclaimed. The crisis that they're in now is inescapable unless they do one of two things. Number one, destroy a huge amount of the world's people and produce in order to fuel a new bit of rebuilding and get the economy kick-started again, i.e. massive war, which also, of course, means massive looting of hopefully countries that you have destroyed. That's the aim of going after Russia, going after China. We've talked about it lots of times. So that's the way out of this crisis fundamentally for them. Of course, the other way is to push down so hard on the workers, or it seems to be a way. If you push down so hard on the workers, you can kind of, get the level of profitability up a bit. But the problem is when you're doing that, you are simultaneously destroying the market for your goods, right? So we've talked about that before as well, Garland, haven't we? This is a knot you can't get out of. For the capitalists, ultimately, it's only war. It's only winning a war of massive devastation that will rebalance the system for another, 20 years or something. And then you're back in the same hole that you're in now, only worse. The only other way out is for the working class to realize we've got to stop imagining that the solution to our problems is inside of the system of capitalism, because it really isn't. We have everything we need to solve our problems. We have science, we have a huge labor force, we have advanced technology, we have advanced machinery of production. You put all of those things together, you have the ability to create not only a decent life for everybody, but a constantly rising standard of living, not just for a section of the population, for literally everyone on the planet. That's absolutely within humanity's grasp, right? What we have to do is stop allowing ourselves to be divided against one another and stop looking for solutions from the system that is creating all these problems.
That is a great way to end this segment. A perfect way to end this segment. Thank you very much, Joti Brar. Tell everyone where they can find all of your good works and the works of you and your comrades.
Thank you. Well, I always promote our Telegram channels because it's my preferred medium of social interaction. So I have a channel, Joti Brar, and my party has a channel, The Communists. And I would ask people to subscribe to both of those. We have a YouTube channel called Proletarian TV, which has a huge range of educational materials on all kinds of topics going back, to the early days of YouTube, basically. And our website, thecommunists.org, I would advise people to follow the content there. We produce analysis that cuts through all the noise and gets to the heart of the matter. And especially on our website, if you're thinking about the ideas that I put forward in these programs, I would ask you to look for under the Learn tab on our website. There's a Marxist study program. And really, we need as many people as possible who understand that there are problems in today's world and the working class needs to organize itself and train itself to solve the problems itself, to get organized and do the necessary. Well, what we need is for as many of those people as possible to study Marxism and train themselves to become Marxists, preferably with an organization, but you can start by yourself until you start to get the hang of it. This is a really important task that faces us, because the bourgeoisie is constantly drowning us in lies and misinformation and distorting our sense of reality to disorient us, to make us feel hopeless and helpless and isolated and fragmented, and again, to keep us divided, confused, and stupid, and therefore manipulable. And that's how they turn us into cannon fodder instead of material for revolutionary, transformation of society.
Well, what's interesting, there are three great world powers right now. There's one that's China, which says they are socialist with Chinese characteristics. You could discuss the purity of their socialism or not, but one thing you can't discuss, you can't dispute, is their economy is going through the roof, and 90% of the people in the country support their government. Then you've got Russia, a country that has certainly the legacy and the echoes of the Soviet Union. That what is it that powers Russia? Oh yeah, that's right, Gazprom and Rosneft, two state-owned companies, and many other state-owned companies that handle mining and all these other things. So they've got these gigantic state-owned companies that drive the economy as a whole, right? Both of them, the economies are going through the roof. Then you've got one that is dedicated to the purest of neoliberal capitalism that you could ever imagine, and it is in absolutely degenerate ruin. And that country is screaming to the other two that they have to choose our method of economics and social. It's just, you can't make this up. Joti Brar, thank you very much. And hopefully you'll be back next week. These things speak for themselves. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. And don't forget, share this on all your social media platforms. Follow me on Rockfin. Follow me on Rumble. There are times when YouTube and their infinite wisdom will decide that one or more of my videos shouldn't be up, and they'll take it down. And whenever that happens, if ever you watch a live video, and you find that it's gone later, you can follow me on Rockfin and Rumble, because you can go there to see it. Also, follow me on Telegram and share this everywhere. Thanks. We're out.